March 4th, 1970, Miami Beach. A federal agent slid a folder across a table and told Meyer Lansky he was going to prison for the rest of his life. Lansky looked at the folder, looked at the agent, and asked for a glass of water. 3 years later, the government had spent $40 million trying to convict him. They got nothing. Not a single charge that stuck. Not 1 day of prison time. This wasn't luck. It wasn't connections. It was the most disciplined financial mind in the history of American organized crime executing a plan he had been building for 30 years. So how does a man with no political office, no army, and no official title walk away clean when the entire weight of the United States government comes down on him? To understand the answer, the story starts not in Miami, but in a tenement on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the winter of 1914. Hester Street smelled like boiled cabbage and coal smoke, and the particular desperation of people who had traveled 5,000 miles to discover that the promised land looked exactly like the country they had left. Meyer Lansky was 12 years old, small for his age, with eyes that moved faster than his feet, and a brain that processed the world in columns of numbers. He had been in America for 2 years, long enough to understand that the men who ran the neighborhood, the ones who collected the envelopes and settled the disputes and walked through crowds that parted for them without a word, those men did not get rich by being the strongest or the loudest. They got rich by understanding systems, by finding the gaps between what was legal and what was possible and building something permanent inside those gaps. He was watching one of those men, a collector making his Tuesday rounds, when a boy named Charlie Luciano appeared at his elbow. Charlie was 2 years older and already had the kind of face that made people uncomfortable, like he was calculating something unpleasant. "You see what he is doing," Charlie said, not pointing, just indicating with his chin. "He is not collecting money," Meyer said. "He is collecting information." Charlie looked at him. Most kids would have said he is collecting money. "You are interesting, Meyer Lansky." "Call me Meyer," said the boy who would become Meyer Lansky. And the partnership that would reshape American crime for the next 60 years began on a sidewalk that smelled like old fish and coal smoke. By 1920, Prohibition had turned the United States into the largest business opportunity in the history of American crime, and Meyer Lansky had already understood something that almost nobody else in the country grasped. The money was not the point. The systems that moved the money were the point. Every bootlegger in New York was focused on supply and demand, on trucks and warehouses and distribution routes. Lansky was focused on something else entirely. He was focused on what happened to the money after it arrived. Legal businesses needed clean money they could explain to banks and tax collectors. Criminal businesses generated cash that could not be explained to anyone. The gap between those two facts was where Lansky built his empire. Not an empire of violence, not an empire of territory, but an empire of financial architecture, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly what to look for. He sat with Charlie Luciano at a corner table in a restaurant on Mulberry Street in 1921, a ledger open between them, and explained the problem the way a professor explains mathematics to a particularly gifted student. "We are making more money than we can spend," Lansky said, running his finger down a column of numbers. "That sounds like a good problem." Charlie reached for the breadbasket. "It is the worst problem in the business." Luciano chewed and waited. "You cannot put cash money in a bank without explaining where it came from. You cannot buy property without a documented source of income. You cannot leave it to your children without the government asking questions. And you cannot invest it in legitimate businesses without creating a paper trail that leads directly back to where the money started. So what do we do with it? We make it invisible," Lansky said. "We build a system where the money moves through enough legal structures that by the time anyone looks at it, it appears to have come from somewhere respectable." Charlie looked at him for a long moment. "You are talking about something that does not exist yet." Lansky closed the ledger. That is exactly why we need to build it. The architecture took years to construct. Lansky moved through it methodically, adding one layer at a time, testing each component before adding the next. He started with laundries. Not metaphorical laundries, but actual commercial laundry businesses that processed linen for hotels and restaurants. Cash businesses with high volume and variable income, where an extra $10,000 a week could be explained as a good month without raising any particular questions. From the laundries, money flowed into real estate holding companies, and from the holding companies into legitimate investments, and from the investments into numbered accounts in Swiss banks that did not share information with American authorities under any circumstances. He explained the system to Luciano piece by piece over a series of dinners that stretched across 2 years. Together they were building something that had never existed before, a criminal organization that operated with the financial sophistication of a major corporation. The violence was always there, always available, but it was a last resort, not a first one. The real power was in the money, and the real power over the money was in understanding how it moved. By 1930, Lansky had accounts in Switzerland, Cuba, the Bahamas, and 3 separate Caribbean nations whose banking laws had been written specifically to prevent American authorities from reaching deposited funds. The network had taken 10 years to build and could not be dismantled in 10 years of investigation because each component appeared from the outside to be entirely legitimate. A hotel in Havana, a casino license in Nevada, a resort development in Miami Beach. On paper, Meyer Lansky was an investor and businessman with holdings across 3 continents. The fact that the initial capital had come from bootlegging and gambling was buried so deep in the structure that proving it in court would require simultaneously convincing 5 separate sovereign nations to cooperate with an American investigation. Lansky had specifically designed the system to make that impossible. The FBI opened a file on him in 1938. He knew about it within 2 weeks because he had spent 20 years building relationships with the kind of men who knew what files the FBI was opening. He read the summary of their initial intelligence and found it almost entirely accurate about what he had done and completely useless for prosecution purposes. They knew he had money. They knew the money had not come from legitimate business. They could not prove either point in a way that would survive a courtroom. He continued building. Cuba had become his most important asset by 1940. The island sat 90 miles from Florida and operated under a government that Lansky had cultivated carefully for 15 years. He was not buying politicians in the crude sense of handing over cash in exchange for favors. He was doing something more sophisticated and more durable. He was making himself economically essential to the people who ran the country. The casino operations he managed in Havana employed thousands of Cubans. The hotels he built created supply chains that benefited dozens of legitimate businesses. When the Cuban government looked at Meyer Lansky, they did not see a criminal. They saw an investor whose continued presence was worth protecting. This was the principle Lansky had understood since Hester Street. Power is not what you take. Power is what people need you to provide. The moment you become essential to someone's interests, their interest in protecting you becomes genuine. You do not need to threaten or bribe or coerce. You simply make sure that the consequences of your absence are worse than the consequences of your presence. Charlie Luciano, sitting across from Lansky in Havana in 1946, freshly deported from the United States and trying to rebuild his operation from a foreign country, asked him the question directly. "How do you do it, Meyer? You are a Jewish kid from the Lower East Side, and you have more protection than most heads of state." Lansky poured the coffee himself, the way he always did when the conversation was important. "I do not have protection," he said. "I have made myself into infrastructure." Charlie waited. "When something is infrastructure," Lansky continued, "you do not protect it because you like it. You protect it because you cannot function without it. A city does not protect its water pipes because the pipes are admirable. It protects them because without the pipes, the city stops working. I have spent 30 years making sure that a sufficient number of important people cannot function without the systems I have built. That is not protection. That is necessity. And necessity is permanent in a way that protection never is. The system held through the 1950s, through congressional investigations and newspaper headlines, and the kind of sustained public attention that destroyed most men who operated in Lansky's world. The Kefauver Committee hauled him before televised hearings in 1951 and got precisely nothing useful from a man who answered every question with the patient precision of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. He did not refuse to answer. He answered everything completely and accurately in ways that conveyed no actionable information whatsoever. Yes, he had operated casinos. The casinos were legal in the jurisdictions where they operated. Yes, he had accounts in foreign banks. Foreign banking was not illegal under American law. Yes, he knew men who were associated with organized crime. He knew many people. Association was not conspiracy. The committee members looked at him across the table with the frustrated expression of men who understood they were losing, but could not identify exactly where the loss was occurring. Lansky thanked them for their time and returned to Miami Beach. The real crisis came in 1970. The Nixon administration had decided that taking down Meyer Lansky would be a significant law enforcement achievement, and they had assigned resources accordingly. The IRS, the FBI, the Justice Department, the Strike Force on Organized Crime. All of them, simultaneously, focused on a 70-year-old man who weighed 150 pounds and whose most visible activity was walking his dog on the beach every morning at 6:30. The agent who delivered the folder that March morning was named Henderson. He sat across from Lansky in the living room of his Miami Beach apartment and laid out the case with the confidence of a man who believed he had finally found the combination to a lock that had resisted 30 years of picking. "We have your Swiss accounts," Henderson said. "We have the wire transfers. We have testimony from 3 former associates who will place you at the center of a conspiracy to evade taxes on income derived from illegal gambling operations spanning 4 decades. Lansky looked at the folder. He did not open it. He looked at Henderson with the same expression he had shown the Kefauver Committee 20 years earlier, patient and empty and measuring. "May I have a glass of water?" he said. Henderson got him the water. Lansky drank it slowly, set the glass down, and said, "I would like to speak with my attorney." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the window overlooking the beach. He stood there for a moment looking at the water. Then he said, without turning around, "The Swiss accounts are held by a corporation registered in Liechtenstein. The corporation is owned by a trust established under the laws of the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary of the trust is a foundation registered in Panama. American tax law governs the income of American citizens and residents. It does not govern the income of Panamanian foundations. I believe your lawyers already know this. I believe that is why you are here talking to me instead of already having arrested me." He turned from the window. "Please tell my attorney I will call him at 9. The case lasted 3 years. The government spent what would later be estimated at $40 million across 4 separate agencies attempting to construct a prosecution that would survive appeal. They got close twice. Both times, the architecture Lansky had built over 4 decades held. Witnesses recanted or died or discovered inconsistencies in their own testimony. Documentary evidence from foreign institutions failed to materialize because those institutions were operating under laws that made sharing it criminal under their own jurisdiction. The Panamanian Foundation had never filed an American tax return because it had no legal obligation to do so. In 1973, the Justice Department quietly dropped the primary charges. A lesser conviction for illegal gambling from 1971 was overturned on appeal in 1972 on the grounds that the evidence had been improperly obtained. Meyer Lansky returned to Miami Beach, resumed his morning walks, and outlived every prosecutor who had spent the 1970s trying to put him away. He died in January 1983 at the age of 80. The FBI closed the file that had been open since 1930.